Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. Thank you for joining us. It's that time of the year where we start winding down, but we're also blessed to meet with special people. And I have one such special person with me today. Professor Henning Melber, as you will recall, is an inspiration and, in my estimation, an ethical and a moral compass. So I'm always honored to be in his company, to learn from him and to spend time listening to him. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much, Henning, for making this time again for me. I know it's a short visit, but you always find the time to accommodate.
Thank you very much, Quraysha, for always finding the time to talk to me. And I'm very humbled and touched by your so kind words.
No, it's a pleasure, Henning. And when I sit and listen to what you say, I always go back later on just to reinvigorate the thoughts and to latch onto the things that you have said. I realize that there is so much that one can learn, not only from your experiences, but your experiences of Dag Hammarskjöld. So, you've written this beautiful book, Dag Hammarskjöld, the United Nations and the Decolonization of Africa. And I was intrigued by the title because decolonization of Africa in Dag Hammarskjöld's time could in many ways be referred to just as the decolonization of the state, not in terms of the epistemic decolonization or systemic decolonization or economic decolonization. So I'm curious to hear from you. What makes you say or link decolonization, and I'm sure it's more than just the withdrawal of the colonial powers from Africa, to Dag Hammarskjöld?
You're absolutely right. If we think about decolonization seriously, it's more than a formal political process. And of lately, post-colonial studies and others have rediscovered that because it's not so new. If you read Frantz Fanon, then you already realize that decolonization is also about mental dispositions, about mindsets, about asymmetric power structures, which continue in what is supposedly a new society, but the old is reproduced in the new. So it's more than formal processes, but Dag Hammarskjöld was in charge of the formal processes in as much as the then Secretary General of the United Nations had a say in the decolonization of Africa. During his time in office, between 1953 and 1961, his untimely death through a plane crash, which is currently reinvestigated. He was in charge when the winds of change were blowing across the African continent. And they were blowing in more than just formal processes. And the book tries to explore the formal processes plus the ideas they related to and the possibilities and roles individuals could play and where their limitations were. And for me, Dag Hammarskjöld is a very interesting person. Coming from a Swedish, rather traditional background, from a family deeply entrenched in a conservative part of Swedish society, but at the same time believing in fundamental human values, which had a very broad approach to human dignity, to social equality, to the rights of people. So my curiosity was, how did Dag Hammarskjöld, with the values he had internalized by the time he resumed possibility as Secretary General, position himself within asymmetric global power struggles at the height of the Cold War? And to that extent, the book touches on something else, which for me is a very personal dimension. Are we predetermined as individuals by the socialization of the society and the values and norms we were raised in, or are we able to make choices?
I'm glad you asked that question because a while back you published an article where you linked spirituality and, in a way, religiosity to many aspects of our lives. And you said that religion matters, spirituality matters. So in that instance, based on what you just asked now, if you're asking if we're predetermined then, can it be that we are excluded of the spiritual aspect and that it's only the genetic makeup? Or would you say then spirituality plays an important part in the choices that we make?
Spirituality is a very important part of what we are and how we think. And even those of us who would easy-handedly dismiss spirituality are in denial, because we are guided by spirituality, even when we dismiss spirituality, because we have belief systems. We might not call them spirituality, but I'm convinced no individual on earth is living without immaterial guidance. And what else is that than spirituality in the widest sense? So I'm very suspicious when people dismiss that and dismiss, let's say, religion, which for them means misguided, narrow-minded. Well, it depends on how you understand and define the term. And in the widest sense, we all are spiritual people.
So would you then say that Hammarskjöld was one such a spiritual character who embodied, the essence of creation in terms of his values and his, very strong links to ethical behavior and social justice?
There is absolutely no doubt that he was, and we have even material proof of it. Because after his death, it was discovered that he had left behind a personal notebook, which he entrusted to one of his friends with the words, "I leave the decision to you if this should be published or not." But anticipating that the decision might be that it is published, it was obvious that he had reworked some of the entries, and he had started that personal notebook while he was in his early 20s. So much earlier than he became a known person, first in the Swedish civil service and then on the global level. And it was published as Markings, and Markings has become a spiritual classic worldwide. One of the latest editions got a preface by Jimmy Carter, previously US-American president with not a lot of fortune, but then in a later life, a staunch human rights activist. And he recognized Hammarskjöld by writing a preface to one of the latest editions of Markings. It's still a bestseller. And if you read Markings, which is a very painful act, because it was constantly a soul-searching effort, and he was ruthlessly self-critical, then you come across references not only to the Bible, but all other different religious traits, spiritual traits, and he goes back to Meister Eckhart and others, and he engages with all those approaches. He engages with Martin Buber, he engages with others, he engages with Hinduism, with the Muslim thought, with all type of things, and for them they were all equally valuable. While he was coming from a Lutheran pietist background, which also meant that he understood life as service and duty. So even as a young man, when he tempered with the thought, if life is worthwhile to be living, or if one would have the liberty to bring an end to one's own life, his conclusion was, I'm not entitled to, because I was given a life to serve. And I would violate that mandate if I would end my life. But all of that shows that if Hammarskjöld was anything, he was a spiritual person, which to some extent came as a surprise to some among those who were very close to him as Secretary General, and said, we never discovered that. While others said, well, there was a vibe where you could see that for him diplomacy, policy, and all other material issues, worldly issues, always had a sense of something deeper and of something bigger and more important.
But then again, that points to the whole concept of purposefulness. You know, that life should not be only about seeking happiness, but that life should be of purpose. Because ultimately, when you fulfill the purpose, then everything else comes into play. Before we go to the break, just very quickly, would you then say that getting involved and, you know, walking in the footsteps of this great figure has brought your own realization for you and created in your approach to life a different sense of purposefulness?
Well, I can use what you just said. You need to realize that fulfilling a purpose is a precondition to happiness. Happiness is a big word, but let's then say to satisfaction. And a satisfactory life means to pursue and fulfill a purpose. And let's hope not an evil purpose, but a noble purpose.
Okay, so we're going to the break. When we come back, I just want to talk about what some of the things that you raised yesterday in terms of the current state of the UN and the big question, if Dag Hammarskjöld was alive, would they have elected him? But we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second segment of a very interesting interview with a very amazing individual, and that is Professor Henning Melber, who is a Professor Extraordinary at the University of Pretoria's Department of Political Sciences. And before we went on to the break, we were touching a little bit about the ethical life of Dag Hammarskjöld and of course the whole concept of spirituality and purposefulness. Now, Henning, you know, you spoke about something which was very interesting for me yesterday, and that is the whole question about, you know, the change. Are we moving forward or have we regressed? If you look at the behavior of the Secretary General of the United States in the 1950s under this leadership, and of course the changes that have come subsequent to that, you had good words to say about Kofi Annan and Boutros Ghali. If you really look at it, both are non-Western in a way, you know, considered from the global South, and these are the kinds of leadership that have not been endorsed or recognized. And then you bring in puppets all the time to continue the work of whoever it is that, you know, are ruling the agenda at the moment. But Hammarskjöld, you say that if you compare his decision making, if you compare his behavior, his leadership, there is a serious regression in the United Nations since then. And surprisingly, I just received a quote from a friend of mine who engages in much decolonial work, and he said, he quoted from an author who was writing about civilization, and they said this whole notion of civilization has been almost disbanded because with the Western Eurocentric narrative in the coming from modernity, the claim was that pre-modern societies were not civilized. But with recent, since the 1970s and the new research, in actual fact, you find that they were very civilized and that they were very tolerant, they were very empathetic, they knew how to live together, and there was very little violence. If you consider these four qualities, you see there is a reverse in modern society. We have exceptional violence, very little tolerance, almost no empathy, and no respect for human life. So the question this author asks, writing this book on civilization, he says, one might ask then, was civilization actually really necessary? So if you have Hammarskjöld here and you're comparing him and his time frame to this time frame, one can ask then, have we adopted the civilization understanding but actually regressed?
Well, maybe to start with an anecdote which is told about Mahatma Gandhi, who was asked by a Western journalist in an interview, what about Western civilization? And he reportedly responded, it's not a bad idea. I think Dag Hammarskjöld believed in civilization, but he would have been skeptical to add Western civilization. I think he would have believed in global civilization. And he hardly ever used the word civilization. He made a lot of statements and speeches. They add up to 4 published volumes with over 2,000 pages, and he was remarkably consistent. But the keywords he used between 1953 and 1961 all the time were solidarity, justice, dignity, and integrity, and consciousness.
Which is almost absent in the vocabulary today.
That vocabulary is missing today. He also stressed the need for an independent international civil service, with him as the highest international civil servant in charge of the Secretariat. And he interpreted the Charter of the United Nations as a secular Bible. There comes the spirituality again. He used that word. For him, the Charter of the United Nations was a secular Bible, which resulted in several people who tried to appreciate and recognize his terms in office to call him a secular Pope. And he stressed that as Secretary General, his ultimate mandate is to make sure that member states who ratified the Charter and all the subsequent normative frameworks, like the Human Rights Charter, the Genocide Convention, and all the other conventions that followed on them as basic fundamental normative frameworks, that they have to be held accountable to what they ratified, and that they have to live up to the principles, values, and norms which by ratification were made domestic acts, which have always been violated. And he criticized them for deviation, independent of where they came from. So in today's jargon, you would say he was, among the Secretary Generals so far, the only one who truly deserved the attribute anti-hegemonic. And as a result, while he was the second term in office, he managed to be criticized not only by the Soviet bloc, but also by the Western countries who increasingly with suspicion looked at what he suggested. While he got a lot of approval of the newly independent states from the global south, not least from the African continent, because they understood he was their Secretary General. And he always said the United Nations is not there for the big powers. It's there to provide room and space and voice for all the other member states.
So very quickly, I want to interrupt you there. Based on that, seeing that that was his approach, would you then say that he shied away from or excluded this concept of being neutral? Because to be neutral would not be to exercise justice then, isn't it?
No, he had a different approach. He said, if you are loyal to these values as international civil servant, then you at times have to take sides.
So you make a choice.
Making a choice for the values as codified in the Charter of the United Nations and in the Human Rights Charter. And he said, if you do that, and it ends you in opposition to certain member states, then that is a sign of true neutrality.
Wow, okay.
Because you can't abstain.
Yes,
you can't remain neutral when it comes to fundamental values.
You have to make a decision.
Absolutely.
So, considering then this very powerful standpoint, would you then say that he was a threat to certain nations at that time? Because, I mean, it was a very difficult time in the history of the world, if you really look at it. And in the 1960s, we were heading towards the decolonization, the actual withdrawal of colonies from Africa. So if he was supporting social values, social justice, these values, then he must have been a threat.
Yes, he was a threat. He was a threat to the vested interests of all the big powers. And he was positioning himself and trying to position the organization, as difficult as it was, if not impossible as it was, because there were limits to his office, vis-à-vis asymmetric power relations in the world. I give you two examples. He very early in the office already said that for him, ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the UN, would be more important than the Security Council, because his understanding was based on the assumption that if you do not provide fair international economic relations, you will never create the necessary basis for lasting peace and development and human rights. I have not heard a Secretary General of lately making such a statement. The other thing was then when he was increasingly meeting resistance by the influential veto powers in the Security Council, that he tried to bypass the Security Council by going to the General Assembly and seeking approval for resolutions there which might force the Security Council to act. This has happened of lately at times, but Dag Hammarskjöld was the first who utilized this tool to strengthen those who otherwise would have no direct influence over the decision-making process.
So now, in all of this, you speak of his death, his untimely death, and you say that there is a investigation that has been relaunched. He had enemies. Who would celebrate his death? And which countries do you find, or do you know of, are still withholding information about his death?
As member states, no one openly celebrated his death. They wouldn't. That's against all diplomatic behavior. But there was a certain relief among mainly Western governments that he could not pursue his agenda further. The Soviets objected to him already openly before, but there were direct open celebrations in the then settler colonial minority regimes. In northern Rhodesia, in southern Rhodesia, in South Africa, I know from hearsay from people of my age that their parents openly celebrated and toasted to the news that Dag Hammarskjöld died in a plane crash approaching Dola in the copper belt of today's Zambia, together with 15 others, because they considered him a threat to their minority regimes.
So do you think that South Africa had information?
There is speculation that South Africa, but also the Western powers, had sufficient information as to who was behind external influence that forced the plane to crash, which is a different story and a much more credible story to the one claiming it was a pilot's error. What we know today is that it was not an accident, but the crash of the plane was brought about through a second plane in the air, which directly or indirectly impacted to the extent that the plane approaching the airport crashed.
So, I mean, it's, in my opinion, it's not, and it's a humble opinion, it's not a conspiracy theory, because, I mean, we know of many instances where you want to get rid of a leader or you want to get rid of somebody. You either crash his plane or you institute a coup. That's how hegemonic powers usually work. But we're right at the end. What would you like to leave us with, a parting message?
We should revisit Dag Hammarskjöld and many others. He was not a singularity. And make us aware that we do not have to reinvent the wheel. The commitment and engagement for values existed since a long time. We should just live up to what others already did in personal sacrifices, in their integrity to values and norms, in search of social justice and human dignity.
I just want very quickly one last comment about your opinion of Boutros Boutros-Ghali and Kofi Annan.
He was closest to Dag Hammarskjöld in the footsteps, and that's why he did not get a second term in office as
Boutros Boutros-Ghali.
Boutros Boutros-Ghali, as so far the only one of the Secretary Generals. And maybe one of the reforms of the UN system would mean give a Secretary General one term in office, but longer than 5 years, So that the first term in office is not basically a rehearsal to be re-elected for a second term in office.
Okay, so we're at the end. I would like to say thank you very much for that. I specifically asked that question of Boutros Boutros-Ghali because I remember his name during the Bosnian genocide. And for me, it always stuck, but I think we were too young to actually consider all of these bigger issues, which I always go back and listen to what you have to say, and it sheds a lot of light. Thank you, Henning, for sharing your time. And if you can, make sure you access this book of Henning for those of you who are interested. But not only that, I think it helps to lift the soul when we find that there are, and there have been in our history, ethical leadership. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.